I've been a consultant now for about 12 years, and one of the things every consultant learns pretty much early on is that the correct answer to almost any question about software is, it depends. And this isn't just a consultant's cop-out, it's true. The right approach in most situations depends on the nature of the project, the team, the organization, its culture, the technologies being used, and so on. And so you have to think about how to adapt any practices and concepts to the specific situation you're in. But in my travels throughout the universe, as I've worked with many organizations to try to help them improve their requirements, I have detected several things that I believe are cosmic truths, universal concepts, realities regarding requirements that I think are broadly applicable in any situation. And those are the things I'd like to share with you today. Now, to kind of get us started, I have a picture here that some of you might have seen that I think really makes the point. The manager says, I'll go up and find out what they need, and the rest of you start coding. Now, some people think the caption ought to read, now that you're finished coding, I'll go up and find out what they need. Now, I showed this cartoon at a company a few years ago, and somebody said, wow, this would be a lot better than what we do. And I found that very frightening because I think we can do a much better job than this. Now, this is, I should point out, what we call in the training business a cartoon. It is not a process description. And we can do a lot better than this sort of traditional approach to requirements. So let's take a look at some of these cosmic truths about software requirements. Sorry, I wouldn't do that on every slide, but I couldn't resist for this one with our cosmic theme here. So our first cosmic truth is that if you don't get the requirements right, it really doesn't matter how well you execute the rest of the project because you're going to fail. Requirements form the foundation of all of the work that follows. You can do a great job in design, you can write perfect code, but if it doesn't satisfy the customer's needs and expectations, you haven't made it. Now, I don't necessarily mean the initial requirement specification you come up with early in the project, but rather the full set of requirements knowledge that you discovered during the course of the project. This is what we have to get right. Let me also point out that nothing I say today implies that we have to follow a waterfall or sequential life cycle. I'm not suggesting that it's possible or in most cases even desirable to try to get all the requirements at the very beginning and assume they won't change. I mean, yes, okay, that's desirable. We would all like that to happen, but the fact is it's not going to happen, so we shouldn't expect that it will. And we're going to talk about some of these change issues later on. But the principles I'm going to talk about will apply to nearly all kinds of software development projects and systems development projects, no matter what life cycle you're following, including agile approaches. The concepts, the practices still apply. Now, we can subdivide this whole domain of requirements engineering into two main categories, requirements development and requirements management. Requirements development refers to all of the things we do to try to get good requirements. We have to elicit requirements from various sources. We need to analyze those to understand them, break them down into appropriate levels of detail, represent requirements information in different ways. We need to validate that those are in fact the correct requirements and good quality requirements that are going to get the job done for the customers. And then we need to also specify those in a way that communicates clearly to all the other people who need to know about that information. Requirements management then deals with what do you do once you have those requirements in hand? How do you deal with change? How do you track status as you move from requirements that are just concepts all the way down into executable software? Some people like to buy requirements management tools. This is a popular growth direction for a lot of companies. And there's no shortage of these kinds of tools. There are probably 35 or so requirements management products which basically let you store the requirements in a database rather than a traditional written specification of some form. But I want to warn you, sometimes people put their requirements, whatever they have, in a requirements management tool, and they think they're doing a fine job because they have the requirements all stored away and packaged and looking good. But I think you should avoid buying a requirements management tool until you can write good requirements, because I have seen teams get in trouble when they thought they had requirements that were good because they were in the tool, and in reality, it's a classic case of garbage in, garbage out. They're going to help you manage whatever requirements you give them, whether those are good requirements or not. But to keep this truth in mind, we need to get good requirements. Now, you might wonder, well, how do I know if I've got the requirements right? And this is really a question of requirements validation. So we need to think of techniques that will help us get that degree of confidence. One technique is peer review. Let's have people who are going to be looking at the requirements from different points of view examine those and try to see if they are the right requirements, if they're written in an appropriate level of detail, if they're clear and people can understand them. So you need to have different people review them from different angles. For example, you absolutely need to have customer representatives review the requirements and try to imagine if those are going to meet their needs. Those requirements could be in the form of use cases or detailed functional requirements or acceptance tests, but you need the customer input to make that judgment. You also need to have developers who are going to be doing the work based on those requirements, examine them, and see if they can get a confidence level that, yes, I understand what's being asked, I can think of a way to tell if I'm done, and I can go ahead and begin working on designing and implementing those. You need to have testers review the requirements. Testers and developers and customers will all look at requirements from different perspectives. I love to have testers review requirements because they'll spot places where maybe we didn't say what happens if some exception condition arises. They find missing requirements because they think in terms of how do I tell if this is working and how can I break it. So we need to have people look at the requirements with their eyeballs. You might perform simulations to try to judge whether the requirements are going to meet the objectives of the project. And you might have your customer representatives write acceptance criteria. How would they judge that a product based on those requirements was working correctly and letting them get the job done? And I'm going to give you some more techniques later on about how to get the requirements right, but the validation concepts help you tell if you got them right. Now, there are more tools becoming available now that can help you with this. There's a class of requirements development tools that are starting to become available that help you visualize requirements, help you analyze textual requirements for problems, and draw pictures that help you spot errors. But if we don't use those kinds of approaches, if we just assume that whatever requirements we write down are good to go, then you're probably going to have problems on the rest of the project. Now, another technique here is that, little skip there. So cosmic truth number 2. I believe requirements development is a discovery and an invention process, not just a collection process. I often hear people talk about gathering requirements, and I try not to use that term. That kind of gives me the impression that the requirements are just lying around waiting to be collected or waiting to be sucked out of users' brains. It's kind of like picking flowers. You're walking around with a basket and you're looking for requirements wherever they happen to be. You pick up a rock and there's a requirement under there. You just put it in your basket. And it's just not that simple. Absolutely, there is a collection process involved, but requirements development is really an exploration process. It involves discovery, and it includes invention in addition to just collecting requirements that people already know about. In fact, another point to keep in mind here is that requirements development demands iteration. You're simply not going to just ask somebody, what are your requirements, and you collect them all and write them down. We're not going to think of everything at once, and the thinking of stakeholders will change as requirements exploration continues. I think the worst question you can ask during a requirements elicitation discussion is, what do you want? Probably the second worst question is to ask, what are your requirements?